be questioned, and the question goes to the heart of the matter. Given that in creating or recreating a body to exist at time t, God must create it as a body that is either at rest at t or in motion at t. But does it follow that God must either create it as at rest at t or create it as in motion at t? Or could God create the body as a body that has at t a power to determine itself either to be at rest at t or to be in motion at t? Now, Malebranche has another argument, not the continuous creation argument, that the body couldn't have that. It's the argument that bodies, Malebranche is a Cartesian at this point, bodies have only those intrinsic properties that are being extended or modes of being extended, and no power is a mode of being extended. That, of course, doesn't apply to minds, and sure enough, that's fine with Malebranche. And this becomes explicit in controversy with Arnaud. He's arguing that minds and bodies are different in this respect. He's discussing the hypothesis that the soul has a true efficacy by which it can produce in itself changes as real in relation to itself as motion is real in relation to matter.
So that's going to be a mode of thought then.
Yeah. He doesn't actually, the argument doesn't actually settle the question whether that hypothesis is true, but he's claiming that it wouldn't follow from that hypothesis that created things could have efficacious powers to affect bodies. Now, but here's what he argues, and it's the argument that I'm interested in here. He says it's a contradiction in terms for God to move a body in an indeterminate way or toward a body in general. But the natural motion of the soul, the one that defines the human will for Malebranche, is an indeterminate motion. It is a love for the good in general. At every moment, a human being can change the determinations of his love. For that, it is not necessary for him to overcome the power of God, since the particular motions of the soul are not invincible, as the particular motions of bodies are. For they are not, as those of bodies are, a necessary consequence of their conservation or of their continual creation. Now, I think, that the natural motion of the soul is an indeterminate motion is a central and recurrent feature of Malebranche's account of the human will. And I think it commits him to the view that God can and does give human wills a power to determine at any moment some aspects of their state at that moment that God leaves undetermined in creating or recreating them at that moment. That's what I think Malebranche's doctrine of free will commits him to. That may or may not be a plausible view, but it is, I think, perfectly consistent with his views about continuous creation.
So it really does follow, it does require that the continual recreation be asymmetrical in an extremely important way.
With regard to minds and bodies.
With regard to minds and bodies,
right.
And that that the power be conceived of as a kind of thought.
Yes.
Which it in a way in which the power cannot be conceived of as a kind of extension.
Right. But this is, I'm very interested in this because, I'm actually not a rabid anti-determinist, but I'm interested in it because I think that the question of the possibility of an omnipotent God creating beings whose will that omnipotent God does not completely determine is a very interesting question in philosophical theology. And I think that thinking about this shows, at least to my conception, pretty accurately where the nub of the issue is. And the nub of the issue is, can God create a being as having a power to determine something that God has not determined. And it's just as well to conceive of it as what the power the being can have at a given moment to exercise, produce an act at that moment. And that seems to me to be right. That's the question. And I think my argument shows that the question of continuous creation is simply irrelevant to that question.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have two more questions, so briefly, if you may. Yes. Can you pass the microphone back and forth?
Hi. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you take the moment of that act to be. I mean, because obviously it can't be a real act or produce anything real in sort of the Malebranchian sense. So I'm wondering, what do you think is happening in that moment of power?
Well, first of all, as I said, I think that Malebranche's arguments about whether it produces something real, a being or non-being or so forth, is a bungled argument. I think that I think one would need to step back and ask, what is at issue when we talk about some effect, state of affairs involving more being than another? I think the typical opinion of analytical philosophers is nothing is at stake because that's just meaningless. I don't want to say that. On the other hand, I don't want to jump to the conclusion that what Malebranche was saying makes perfectly good sense either. What's clear, I think, is that, as it were, the condition of the soul that decides one way is different from the condition of the soul that decides the other way, and in a way that Malebranche himself insists has the greatest eternal consequences. And that being so, I wonder, how much ice the business about real and unreal cuts. Okay. What I am in a way more interested in is about the question of the moment. And I want to emphasize that I don't think that anything hangs here on the supposition, which I suspect is simply impossible, absolutely impossible, that time has an atomistic structure, that it's composed of durationless instants, really composed of them. And that again, I don't think Malebranche actually says that. Anything that's important to him there, look, the question, suppose that instants are just boundaries of durations. And what's important is that, for Malebranche, is that God could make any instant the first instant of the existence of some creature. And for any creature that already exists, God could make any future instant the last instant of that creature's existence. It isn't, from those, it does not follow that God could make some instant the first and last instant of some creature's existence. And I wouldn't want to assert the latter myself, but Malebranche doesn't have to.
Just, if I could just follow up quickly, Malebranche does, when it comes to the real and non-real distinction, it seems like in his last work he draws this distinction between the physical and the moral. And if we take the physical to be the real in sort of the sense that God is the real cause or the true cause, and that humans, in a sense, can be moral causes, whatever we might think that mean, that might be a way around suggesting that what we do is nothingness somehow.
Yes. Though, I mean, I do have to emphasize how limited, how very limited is the scope of the free will that Malebranche ascribes to us and, of course, to himself. it's not a sort of free will that I think is obviously terribly relevant to the kind of responsibility that we have to each other, or indeed terribly relevant to questions of whether if one human being kills or maims another, God has responsibility for what happened to the second person, because everything in that event, except the guilty human beings making of a series of decisions, sinful decisions about resting his or her love in particular and unworthy objects of love, although they are good in themselves, that somehow, that series of decisions were occasional causes by which the efficacy of God's will was determined to a series of external events that resulted in the death or maiming of the other person. That's all that the sinful individual did. So, but Malebranche, as I said, I think Malebranche is interested in that doctrine of free will. All Malebranche really cares about is being able to say that we are to blame for our sins and God is not to blame for our sins. He is not, I see little manifestation of any interest of Malebranche in using his theory of free will to defend our responsibility to each other.
I'm afraid we're probably out of time there, but unfortunately we do have to come to an end at some point, so thank you very much once again.
You're welcome.
For those who registered for the dinner, that starts at 6:30. It's not too far of a walk.